Hong Kong, where shots are being fired, chaos is ensuing and only beginning as we are approaching a very important Chinese anniversary. And that's why in this video, we're going to tell you exactly what's going on, how this compares to the Ukrainian Revolution, the Thucydides trap, a lot of geopolitical talk, but most importantly, an unbiased look into exactly what is happening on the ground, and of course also politically, as we move very close to the crescendo moment of this protest, which has everyone on edge. And as a reporter who's been on the ground in Hong Kong, I could definitely tell you the situation is far more complicated than, of course, the media is letting you on to understand. Now, the battle for Hong Kong has been happening for a very long time, geopolitically setting the stage where a new emerging power, China, is, of course, being challenged by the current Western powers. Economically, the interests are, of course, very well represented on opposing sides, and socially, where over 4 months now, protests have enthralled, and some would even say shut down Hong Kong. Characterized as pro-democracy protests in the Western media, that very interestingly started to cover the protest significantly less than they did before. But if there's one thing becoming very clear from these protests is that they're not going away, but only escalating from here, as we just saw moments ago, with shots fired and chaos in the streets of central Hong Kong as demonstrations and the police response turned very violent, as street barricades were erected and lit on fire, tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets filled the streets, as protesters fired back with petrol bombs, rocks, engulfing the mainly tourist area into a full-on riot area. And clashes definitely turned very ugly. I would say the worst that I've personally seen, with a lot of the foreign press coverage surrounding an incident, of course, when an Indonesian journalist was shot in the face with a less lethal munition after an incident that has many people asking and demanding answers. But with optics like this, and a random journalist doing her job being hit and dangerously injured, you could definitely understand how these are very, very bad optics, to say the least. And just watching some of the footage that led up to this particular event, you could definitely see police officers retreating, and one officer with his rifle shooting less lethal munitions, for some reason, as he's escaping, just decides to randomly shoot in the crowd where this journalist was, of course, shot in the face. Inconsiderate, to say the least, definitely unprofessional, and definitely untrained actions by this police officer that caused this most likely irreversible damage to this journalist. And then again, this story personally impacts me, since not so long ago I was there and there were shots whizzing by me and other fellow journalists, and that could easily be me or someone that I know, or someone that's currently out there that's one of my friends. And knowing the carnage that these bullets could do on the human body, it definitely is not a pleasant thing to think about. Definitely seems like there's escalations from both sides, but specifically the police also using strobe lights against journalists and protesters, trying to, of course, block video footage of exactly what's going on. There's even this footage of a man that is disabled in the very highly populated area where these protests are happening, having a very difficult time trying to, of course, escape the tear gas that was thrown everywhere, as well as the water cannons that also sprayed into the crowds, affecting other journalists. Water cannons not only emitting blue dye, but also an irritant. It's important to understand here that there is a pepper irritant in the water, and I remember myself from covering these events, just having some of the water on my left forearm, and for a very long time feeling like my left forearm was entirely on fire. Now, with the tear gas surrounding you during these events, any exposed skin already feels on fire, but this was another level of just excruciating pain on top of every other skin that was exposed, that really is an extreme deterrent from getting hit by the water cannons that, of course, are being used against the protesters right now. And it literally feels like your arm is on fire or whatever body part was affected by this kind of a water cannon that's being used against the protesters, as you're seeing in this video. Now, the protesters are, of course, escalating tensions as well, setting up roadblocks, lighting them on fire. There's been many altercations and fights where, depending on the occasion, either pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese people are jumped and attacked, as seen in this video. Also, it's very interesting to see RT's coverage of this entire matter, since it's very different compared to their coverage of protests in the United States. But also, it is important to show both sides, which we're doing here. Unlike so many other news organizations, there are other businesses and private property of people who do support China that are being attacked in Hong Kong. And the tension here is definitely moving in a pendulum and feeding on itself, creating more violence from both of the sides. And you could definitely expect this to escalate as we move close to a very important anniversary this coming Tuesday. But already, like we saw from just moments ago, there was even undercover police officers that dressed up as protesters, and when they were uncovered, decided to pull their guns, and it does look like some shots were fired during these protests. This is also not so long ago, since of course the police made a statement that they can and may use lethal force against protesters, specifically the protesters who are throwing Molotov cocktails against them. And while the madness ensued, some took to a train station to escape, which was actually shut down, had the gates and doors closed behind them, leaving some protesters trapped, which, according to some people on the ground there, firefighters intervened and decided to open up the doors, while other protesters decided to escape through, of course, other methods. Now, if there's one thing that's very clear about these protests, is that they're extremely intelligent and impressive to see, especially when you're in the chaos and madness, to see the level of kind of hive mind organization that does carry itself out and demonstrate itself, as even shown in this video, where protesters create a supply line funneling first aid, barricade materials, and even umbrellas and other equipment from, of course, far away from the demands of people on the front lines through messages on Telegram. And by the way, we covered a lot of these techniques and very intelligent hive mind protesting examples in our video that is titled Outsmarting the Government, Next Level Protesting You Couldn't Even Imagine. The link to that will be in the description below so you could watch it. But the support for these protests comes from many places, one of which is, of course, also Taiwan, another geopolitical enemy against China, that, of course, is holding their own rallies and even sending up to 20,000 gas masks to Hong Kong. The United States, which of course is geopolitically positioned against China in a insidious trap, seeing China as the new emerging power that is challenging its hegemony, is of course also embracing Hong Kong in some kind of limited fashion, with the United States Senate Foreign Commission in the U.S. House of Representatives passing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which U.S. Senator Marco Rubio calls a bill that comes at a critical time when, quote, Hong Kong's autonomy and freedoms are under assault by interference from the Chinese government and Communist Party. Now, it's important to understand here, Marco Rubio is a big, let's just say, interventionalist. He previously called for, of course, intervention in Venezuela, in Syria, all that have gone horribly wrong. He even tweeted a bloody image of the former leader of Libya during, of course, his push to have U.S. intervention in Venezuela, which kind of highlights this man's very erroneous, crazy kind of thinking. Now, with the approval of this bill in committees in the House of Representatives, this definitely does anger China, as the bill, which, by the way, will be voted on soon, would mandate sanctions against Chinese officials that are deemed responsible for their, quote, undermining basic freedoms in Hong Kong. The bill is mainly an economic warfare bill that would target individuals from China and may even allow visas for Hong Kong residents to flee their country and be able to resettle in the United States. That is still being debated right now, with many critics labeling this bill as violating China's sovereignty and interfering in China's internal affairs. And it does look like this bill will pass and will have severe diplomatic effects between China and the United States. Even though this bill is very unlikely to have a major effect on the current situation there, but we also need to remember that there are Western economic, not only US, but also German and other European countries' interests still in Hong Kong, who themselves don't like the future that Hong Kong is heading towards, and of course are fervent supporters of the protests that are happening right now. This is why we're seeing such favorable coverage from the Western media about this specific issue. Because if you look at specifically Western protest coverage in the mainstream media, it is specifically done for greater geopolitical purposes. There are other protests who don't fit along to the agenda of the special interest that get totally ignored, like the Yellow Vests. Other protests that do have ties to business, that do serve the agenda that they want promoted, of course, do get pushed out there to you. And this is why we're seeing Hong Kong being covered in some way. And a lot of this is kind of hidden in the talks of democracy. This is not democracy. This is economic interest, as even Newt Gingrich admitted it to be, since, of course, the United States doesn't have the best track record of spreading democracy. They have a great record of carpet bombing countries, but not really supporting democracy. All of this is happening as Nathan Law, one of the previous leaders of the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, is in Washington, D.C., meeting with high-level politicians, trying to, of course, push the passage of this bill and trying to galvanize some kind of American support behind Hong Kong. Even specifically calling for Donald Trump to get involved in this fight, which he honestly has been very reluctant to. But many people, including Joshua Wong, along with other leaders of the previous movements in Hong Kong, like Joshua Wong, are comparing this situation to the new Berlin during the Cold War. Now, Trump's comments about Hong Kong were made at the United Nations during, of course, the General Assembly, where he said that China's future on the world stage will be determined by how they treat the current situation in Hong Kong. Saying, of course, that he also counted on President Xi as a great leader, of course, very carefully reading from a teleprompter, watching what he said, because this is a very tumultuous situation, a situation that could erupt and become something that no one wants to, of course, deal with. As with other historical Thucydides traps that have ultimately led to war, we have to understand that the possibility of this is also very possible here. But with some experts, of course, predicting an economic decline, with, of course, also the population of China, maybe there's a chance of avoiding this usual Thucydides trap conflict that historically always happens. But one thing that is very clear is that a lot of people are left on edge since the crescendo of this movement is approaching and will happen this Tuesday, as China is set to celebrate its 70th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, with protesters saying that this date will be marked as a, quote, a day of grief. Now, as you've seen from our reporting, there has been some kind of military buildup along the Hong Kong border by, of course, the Chinese military. But with the world expecting a very heavy-handed approach by China, I would expect a more strategic one by that country, from my own personal analysis, to simply step back and let the protests unfold as they are, hoping that they will dwindle and extinguish themselves. And I believe that this will be a strategy that China will, of course, utilize this coming Tuesday, as already the police approach is extremely extensive in Hong Kong, and it's only doing the opposite of what it's expected to do from the Chinese. Instead of quelling the protests, it's growing the protests. And unless there's full-blown martial law 2.0 established in Hong Kong, which I extremely doubt, which would be extremely difficult, which would expand a lot of the resources, diplomatically also hurt China on the world stage, I do not foresee this happening, but I do foresee a greater level of violence that we have ever seen in Hong Kong coming up this specific Tuesday, which will also have greater geopolitical implications that, of course, we will be keeping a very close eye on this independent media organization. Now, I do have some sources and friends on the ground there, so of course, stay tuned for coverage here. And whatever unfolds, it's always important to take a look at it from both particular sides and even understand that if something does work in the favor of the geopolitical American system, doesn't always mean that it's bad as well. All possibilities should be understood here by being able to look at all the information here without any big agenda, which of course we strive to do, and we do mainly because of your support, your donations on wearechange.org/donate, and you guys keeping us fully independent. If you think that we did that, share this video with your friends and family members. If you didn't, let us know in the comment section below what you think we could have done better. Did we miss anything about this big particular event that just unfolded? Well, I'm sure you guys will let us know. I'm looking forward to engaging with you in this intellectual discourse down below. Stay tuned for more here on WeAreChange.org. I love you.